In 1848, Franz Joseph crushed revolution with steel and fire. In Hungary, he drowned nationalism in blood. In Italy, he restored imperial rule through bayonets and brutality. But victory, as we saw, came at a cost, not just in lives or legitimacy, but in the quiet hatred it sowed across the empire. A decade later, the fires reignite, and this time the empire does not win. France and Sardinia launch war against Austria. On the battlefield, Franz Joseph will take command himself for the first and last time in his life. But the results are disastrous. The war ends not just in defeat, but in humiliation. For the emperor, for the army, and for the illusion that the empire could hold Italy by force alone. But why did Franz Joseph walk into this war? How did Austria's fragile grip on Italy crumble? And what scars did the war leave on a monarch already weighed down by trauma and failure? This is not a story of nations. It is the story of a man already haunted by revolt, now betrayed by his own hubris and by history itself. This is the road to destruction, the World Wars. The First Italian War of Independence had ended in 1849 with Austrian victory. Field Marshal Radetzky's crushing of the Piedmontese at Novara had reasserted imperial control over Lombardy and Venetia. Venice fell later that year, but as we saw, it was a victory soaked in bitterness, and one that left behind deep scars. In the decade that followed, Austria imposed martial law in its Italian provinces. Censorship was total. Dissenters were jailed, executed, or exiled. The emperor's rule rested on bayonets and surveillance. Franz Joseph viewed Italy not as a province to be reformed, but as a threat to be managed. He saw nationalism not as a political movement, but as a cancer, one that had to be cut out again and again. The repression was meant to restore order, but it had the opposite effect. Every crackdown deepened resentment. Every execution widened the divide. Italy was not quiet. It was simmering. And outside Austria, powerful forces were watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Chief among them, the kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Though defeated, it had not been destroyed. In fact, after the humiliation of 1849, Piedmont began to transform politically, militarily, and diplomatically. The rise of Count Camillo di Cavour, a master of statecraft, and Victor Emmanuel II, a monarch willing to gamble everything for unification, created a new kind of threat to Austria. One more sophisticated, more subtle, and far more dangerous. And behind Piedmont stood a new and eager ally, France. In the 1850s, Austria found itself increasingly isolated on the European stage. Its actions during the Crimean War, a tepid stance that alienated both Russia and France, had left it without friends. Britain no longer trusted Vienna. Russia felt betrayed. And Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, had his own ambitions in Italy. The diplomatic tide was shifting. But Franz Joseph didn't see it. Or rather, he didn't want to. Ever since the revolutions of 1848, Franz Joseph had retreated inward, emotionally and politically. His worldview was rigid, his trust limited, and his approach to Italy unchanged. The emperor still believed that authority came from above, from God, through him. He still saw concessions as weakness. He still believed that loyalty could be commanded through force. It was a delusion, and it was about to be exposed. When Cavour met secretly with Napoleon III at Plombières in 1858, the stage was set. France would support Piedmont in a war against Austria, in exchange for territory in return. The goal: drive Austria out of Italy and pave the way for unification. Austria, of course, saw none of this coming. Franz Joseph dismissed the diplomatic rumblings as noise. He believed his empire was strong, his army was ready, and the Italians, still reeling from 1848, would never dare rise again. He was wrong. In early 1859, tensions escalated. Piedmont began mobilizing troops. Austria demanded a halt. but it was all theatre. Cavour wanted war, Napoleon needed glory, and Franz Joseph, despite all signs, gave them exactly what they wanted. He issued an ultimatum. When it was rejected, Austria mobilized its army and invaded Piedmont. The Second Italian War of Independence had begun. For the first time in his life, Franz Joseph would take the field himself, not as a distant ruler, but as commander-in-chief. But the reality of war was far crueler than his romantic notions. The Austrian army, though large, was outdated, its command structure bloated, its tactics relics of a bygone age, and its soldiers, poorly motivated, drawn from dozens of ethnicities, had little loyalty to the emperor or his cause. France and Piedmont, by contrast, had a modernized, mobile army. Their generals were competent, their morale high, and their cause, Italian unity, inspired those they marched to liberate. Austria's initial advance was slow, bogged down by poor logistics and muddled leadership. Franz Joseph quickly found himself overwhelmed. The emperor, though determined, had no real experience. His orders were often confusing. His presence did not inspire. It unsettled. The decisive blow came in June at the Battle of Magenta. The Battle of Magenta was chaos. French and Sardinian forces, better coordinated and aggressively led, outmaneuvered the Austrians. Streets turned into slaughterhouses, units became isolated, communication collapsed, and Franz Joseph, watching from the rear, could do little but witness the unraveling of his army. The defeat was stunning, but worse was yet to come. At Solferino, just weeks later, the full scale of Austria's collapse was revealed. Over 300,000 men clashed in a brutal day-long engagement that saw the Austrian line disintegrate under repeated French assaults. He was only 29 years old, a young emperor commanding a crumbling army, watching his empire bleed. Bodies piled in ditches, screams of the dying echoing across the fields, medics overwhelmed. The emperor, who had once believed in the righteous glory of battle, now saw only its horror. It was his first and last experience of war. After Solferino, he retreated, not just physically but emotionally. Austria sued for peace. Franz Joseph, shaken, humiliated and grieving for the loss of both territory and pride, accepted terms that saw Lombardy ceded to France and then to Piedmont. The empire had lost its crown jewel in Italy, and Franz Joseph had lost something far more personal, his belief that he could save the empire by force. For Franz Joseph, the defeat in Italy was more than a political setback. It was an existential crisis. He had marched to war believing in his divine right, believing that discipline and duty would prevail, that the old order could still hold, that he, as emperor, had the strength to preserve what his ancestors had built. But Italy had proven otherwise. The defeat shattered his confidence. He withdrew from the public. His court grew colder, more insular. The rigidity of his rule hardened, and the distance between emperor and people grew ever wider. In private, he blamed the generals, the army, even God. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was his war, his command, his failure, and yet, rather than change course, he doubled down. Austria would retreat inward. Reform was off the table. Nationalism would be met with greater repression. Concessions were treason. Compromise was surrender. Italy, he believed, was lost not because Austria was wrong, but because the world had changed, and that change terrified him. The loss of Lombardy was not just a blow to Austrian pride, it was a strategic disaster. It exposed the empire's southern flank, it emboldened nationalist movements across Europe, and it revealed, for all to see, that the Habsburg Colossus was hollow. Within Italy, the dream of unification was now real. Sardinia had emerged as a leader of that cause. France had proven willing to act, and Austria, once the enforcer of reaction, had shown itself vulnerable. Within the empire, other nationalities took notice. Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, and Poles all saw the cracks in the imperial foundation. And outside Austria, one man watched with interest, Otto von Bismarck. From the sidelines, Bismarck saw the Italian defeat as proof that Austria was no longer invincible, that the empire could be challenged and beaten. The stage was being set, not just for Italian unification, but for a deeper, more deadly rivalry. Austria had survived 1848. It had survived Hungary. It had survived the Crimean fallout. But it would not survive another war like this. And that war was coming. After the defeat, Franz Josef returned to Vienna a different man, older, colder, angrier. He had walked into Italy a monarch. He returned a relic, but still he refused to change. His ideology, the divine right, the iron fist, the central state, remained intact. He clung to absolutism like a man clinging to a lifeline. Reformers were sidelined, nationalist demands ignored, the army rebuilt, but without reflection. Austria doubled down on control, not innovation, on tradition, not progress. It was a tragic misreading of the moment, because the world was changing rapidly. Italy was moving toward unification, Germany was stirring, liberalism was gaining strength across Europe, and Austria, rigid, backward, paranoid, was slowly becoming a fossil in the age of steam and steel. And at the center of it all stood Franz Josef, not a villain, not a tyrant, but a man out of time. The war in Italy had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. Austria had lost Lombardy, but it had also lost something deeper, its aura of invincibility, its grip on its provinces, its confidence, and Franz Josef had lost a piece of himself. From this point forward, he would rule not with hope, but with fear. But far to the north, in the kingdom of Prussia, another monarch was watching. And beside him a rising force, brilliant, ruthless, calculating, was taking notes. Otto von Bismarck. He had watched Austria's humiliation, and he had plans of his own. Next time, on road to destruction, the world wars. Bismarck versus Austria. The Austro-Prussian rivalry ignites. How Germany's rise became Austria's nightmare.